Welcome. We're so excited to have you. This is so great that we can spend this time together this afternoon. It is pouring rain where I am, so I hope it's sunny for those across the country. I hope it's warmer and it's actually cold and rainy here. So I hope it's sunny where you are. I'm Zahra Ebrahim. I'm the board chair for Park People. I have the honor and privilege of being the board chair of Park People. And we're gathering today to celebrate the launch of the third annual Canadian City Parks Report. So feel free to, shout out, your geek love for the Parks Report as I think we all feel it. We're all here, but I think this is really exciting. The fact that this is, the third time this is happening, and year over year, the data and the information gets so much more nuanced and rich. So we're so excited to hear from the authors of the report today. We'll hear a 20-minute presentation of the key findings from the Canadian City Parks Report, some of the awesome stories. There's some beautiful stories. If you've had a chance to look at the website, all of the stories are there, but we'll hear from the authors some of the bright moments and the really surprising moments from the research. And then we'll have a moderated discussion. We won't have formal time for Q&A, but I will be looking at the chat. And so please put your questions in and we'll do our best to weave that into the questions that we're asking our speakers. Now, if you are joining from a Francophone community, we've got you today. We are offering French simultaneous interpretation. So if you want to take advantage of this, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little globe that says interpretation, and you want to be in the French audio room option so that you can hear our presentation and our discussion in French. I will do my best to speak as slowly as possible to give some love to our interpreter. And today's webinar will also be recorded, so it'll be available on our website, on the Canadian City Parks Report website for future reference. And for those of you who are joining a Park People webinar for the first time, let us know in the chat. We'd love to meet you and say hello. But just also, we wanted to tell you that our work focuses on helping people activate the power of parks and improve the quality of life in cities across Canada. And we offer comprehensive supports to grassroots community groups. You'll hear about some of that in the report, to nonprofit organizations and municipal staff across the country that are working to animate and enhance their local parks. And so we're going to get into the conversation. We'd like to ground ourselves. We know that some of you have told us where you're calling from, what land you're calling from. And we just want to show our gratitude today for the critical connection of the land that we all call in from, zoom in from, wherever we are in the country, and its critical connection to the health of all of us. So the land acknowledgement I'm going to share today has been formulated for Toronto, which is where I am and where our Park People head office sits. And, a land acknowledgement is meant to be personal. And so, for wherever you are across the country, it's, we strongly feel that it's our individual responsibility to get to know that land. With this in mind, if you're located anywhere that's not Toronto, we encourage you to sort of add some color about where you are in the chat. So Park People acknowledges that the land we call home sits on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or generations past. I'd also like to acknowledge those of us who came here forcibly, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Therefore, we honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. We are mindful of broken covenants, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other, and we'll be talking about that today. We also just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge the grief that our Indigenous friends and all Canadians are feeling right now, and sending them our solidarity and commitment to leverage our individual and collective privilege and power to interrupt anti-Indigenous racism in Canada. And really just want to take a breath and a beat to acknowledge all the stories that are not yet told, and to honor those as well. And so in the context of today's discussion, it feels especially important to recognize that the legacy of Indigenous displacement that has led to the creation of many urban parks and public spaces, and the historical role of urban planning in settler colonialism and dispossession. In this conversation today, and in our work more broadly, it is our responsibility to guide and implement practices and policies that uphold and restore Indigenous relationships to the land. We hope that our acknowledgement invites us all to reflect on the ongoing colonial injustices in our park systems and bring that awareness and groundedness to this conversation today. And so if you haven't already, please introduce your land in our chat. And if you don't know which land you're on, you can visit nativeland.ca, which I think our team is going to put in the chat, which shares the territories of Indigenous people across the world. So actually, wherever you are in the world, it's a beautiful tool to use to ground yourself. So welcome. We are going to very quickly move to introducing our incredible speakers, our panelists, the report authors. I always find it very uncomfortable to have my bio read, but then when I'm the one moderating, I love reading people's bios because everyone's so cool. So we're going to go that way today. And so we're going to start by introducing Tobin Garrett, who's Park People's Manager of Policy and Planning. During nearly 8 years of Park People, Jake has co-authored multiple research reports, including all 3 years of the Canadian City Parks Report. You should have some kind of badge for that. We will work on that, Jake, as well as major studies into the social life of parks, public space governance, and inclusive engagement strategies. We also have Adri Stark. Adri Stark is a project manager at Park People, focusing on research and policy. She has also co-authored all 3 years of the Canadian City Parks Report and contributed to research exploring belonging in public space, the social impacts of parks in underserved neighborhoods, and so much more. I've had the pleasure of working with actually all of our authors today, and they're extremely thorough and thoughtful in their research. And Naomi Amberber is a Black public health researcher who writes about the social and natural environments that foster people's well-being. She strives to bring her passion to all projects she works in, which have included those with the Wellesley Institute and the Center for Active Transportation. Naomi is constantly learning from the people around her and who continue to define the health and livelihoods of their communities. So welcome, feel free to shout them out, fan person them in the chat. The chat is the place where we can feed off your energy. So please feel free to just put words and vibes, and as well as your questions and reflections. You're already getting some love, speakers. And so with that, I will pass it off to you to share your findings from the report.
Thank you so much, Zahra, for that wonderful opening. And thanks everyone for coming today. Zahra, as you were speaking, the sun started to come out here in Toronto, which is so lovely. I actually went for a long walk in the rain earlier and visited a whole bunch of parks, and surprise, surprise, people were out in parks even in the rain. For those of you who don't know, the Canadian City Parks Report tracks the trends, challenges, and opportunities in Canadian city parks each year. And this is our 3rd year of doing the report. And the goal really is to share Canadian best practices, to establish a common set of data that we can all use, and to inspire action. You know, we try, and I hope this comes through when you're reading the report, to present the data, the stories, the examples in a way that's accessible and interesting for everyone, you know, whether you're a park staffer or a community member who's really interested and wants to get more involved. And the way that we create this report, we send a questionnaire out to our participating cities, and we get data and policies and practices back from them. This year, we had 32 participating cities in the report. I know a lot of you are on the call right now, so thank you, from Victoria, BC to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. We also did a public survey of nearly 3,500 Canadians from April of 2021. So I hope some of you are on the call that answered that. And we did over 40 interviews with different experts, community members, city staff, academics, activists, nonprofit organizations. So just a big thanks to everyone. There's a lot of input that goes into this report. We also wanted to thank the Weston Family Foundation. They funded this year of the report, but also all 3 years of the report. And we quite literally wouldn't be able to do this report without them. So thank you so much to the Weston Family Foundation. Also, the RBC Foundation. This is the 2nd year that they've helped us with the reports, particularly the nature section. So if you haven't yet, check out the climate change focus in the nature section, which RBC helped us, supported us in writing. And lastly, Magdalen Site Furniture and the Toronto Foundation, thank you so much, as well as an anonymous donor. Those 2 foundations helped support stories in the activation section of the report around local economic development and community resilience. Okay, so for those of you who have taken a look at the report already online, or maybe you've downloaded the key findings document, You'll know that this is a very big report. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of stories. We get into a lot of things in the report that we're not going to be able to get into on this call. So we're just going to go through the key findings, the key statistics, the examples that kind of bring some of those numbers to life, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion. All right, so first, I think a finding that's probably not going to be surprising to too many people, which is that parks showed high use and high value in the last year during the pandemic. I think many of us know, just sort of anecdotally from going out to visit parks in our communities, that they were very busy, packed in some places. As indoor locations were closed, people really relied on parks more for more things. We saw parks become gyms, co-working spaces, restaurants, maybe if we were ordering food to the park, living rooms where we socialize with friends and family. And for some Canadians, parks became safe homes as well. And we saw this in the numbers. 94% of cities, almost all cities, said that parks use had increased in the last year. And so for us, the question was whether this was going to be a long-term trend, right? Like whether this was going to be something that sticks around a little bit. And so we asked Canadians about this. And what we learned was that, yes, it looks like this is going to be something that sticks around. So 2/3 of Canadians said that they had used parks more during the pandemic. And 82% of those Canadians said that they expect that use to increase or continue post-pandemic. And the same was in the winter. So about 50% of Canadians said that they had used parks more during the winter, and 3/4 of those Canadians said that they expect their heightened winter use during the pandemic to continue or even increase post-pandemic. So, we've seen the impact that this can have. One that's very sort of obvious and maybe directly visible to people is an impact on maintenance needs in parks, but also thinking about new amenities and programs to support this heightened use. And one that comes to mind, for me a lot is all-season washroom access, which is important. Has always been important in parks, but especially during the pandemic when so many more people were using parks and indoor locations like businesses and restaurants where we might have gone to the washroom before were closed, and especially in winter. So thinking through that as these numbers stay high. One particular area we may see an increase in is around stewardship and volunteering. So it was interesting to see that the volunteer numbers actually dropped quite drastically between last year's report and this year's report. So last year we saw just under 12 volunteers per 1,000 people as an average across all the cities in the report. And this year that went down to just under 3 volunteers per 1,000 people. So we know from what cities were saying that they had, restricted some volunteer programs, they canceled or postponed them. I imagine, people were also, for health reasons, not participating as much in some of these programs. So this we've seen though in our survey of Canadians is actually likely to rebound and pick up after the pandemic. So nearly 60% of Canadians said that they're more interested in volunteering due to the pandemic. So the takeaway here really, I think, is that this high use is likely to continue post-pandemic and also perhaps spur more of an interest in volunteering in our parks. So for me, what that means, I think for cities or nonprofit agencies or community groups that kind of work in this space around stewardship, thinking about putting more resources into some of those stewardship programs or more into kind of volunteer engagement to kind of take advantage of that interest. And one example of that might be through park friends groups. These are ways that community members kind of form a community group around a particular park to help steward and give back to that park. But just under 50% of the cities in the report this year actually have park friends group programs in place. So that might be an area to put some attention on over the next year. And now I will turn it over to Adri to continue on with our next key finding.
Thanks, Jake. So yeah, in this year's report, we also learned that people are not only using parks more, but also using parks differently. So 89% of Canadians that we surveyed said that they had tried a new activity in parks during the pandemic. And as Jake mentioned, this often involved taking traditionally indoor activities outdoors. So some of the most popular ones we heard about were eating/picnicking and socializing with friends and family. And then cities responded to this interest in new uses, with 84% of cities implementing COVID-related pilots. So these included things like temporary washrooms in parks, one-way trails to help ensure physical distancing, as well as keeping seasonal facilities like tennis courts open into the winter to sort of support people getting outside in the colder weather. We also saw some cities launch some super creative projects. So Edmonton, for example, created 29 new pop-up community gardens across the city to help address food insecurity, which we know is a big challenge in many communities during the pandemic. And Calgary last winter added free bookable fire pits to parks, which were super popular and saw over 2,000 bookings over the course of the season. Some municipalities also created new community grant programs to help support social connection during this time that we know has been very isolating for many. So for example, Waterloo introduced new pandemic mini grants to support small scale resident-led initiatives that would help bring local neighborhoods together. And Regina created a new $25,000 winter granting program specifically focused on community events that would get people outdoors in the cold. And what we learned through speaking with city staff is that often the cities that were able to respond most effectively were ones that already had sort of well-resourced established park programs in place. So as one sort of amazing example, Kitchener has this natural areas program that offers nature education and stewardship programming to residents. And during the pandemic, they were able to sort of adapt the focus of their programming to focus on wellness and offer things like mindfulness walks and forest bathing to just be able to really tap into that need for mental health supports during COVID. And similarly, Quebec City has this super cool ephemeral places program that's sort of a long-standing program in the city. But this year, in response to the need for more outdoor community gathering places, they were able to double the number of sites where they featured these pop-up activations. So they had 50 sites across the city this year. But at the same time as cities were tasked with responding to these pressures and new uses, we also heard very clearly that budgets were hit. So 60% of cities said COVID had negatively impacted their parks' operating budgets. And this is a real challenge, especially because our survey found that now that people's eyes have sort of been open to all of these new uses of parks, Canadians are looking for more out of their parks long term. So the top 3 measures that our survey respondents said that they would most like to see made permanent include winterized washrooms in parks, outdoor cafes, and outdoor arts and culture events. But of course, these things take resources to sort of become a reality. And the good news on that front is that Canadians want to see their parks funded well to support these changes. So 85% of the folks that we surveyed said that they'd like to see more public funding for parks, which I think just reflects this sort of new appreciation for parks that we've seen in the past year. Another finding that we sort of dove into in the report is just that the pandemic has highlighted the critical role that parks play in public health. So 60% of the cities that we surveyed said that COVID had increased their focus on planning parks for public health, and 89% of those cities expected that this would be a long-term trend. So we anticipate that COVID is sort of having a longer-term impact on the way we think about planning parks and the extent to which we integrate health considerations in that planning. And then we also heard that the pandemic had catalyzed new partnerships. So 84% of cities reported increased collaboration between their parks department and other municipal departments in the past year, including departments like public health. And then recognition of the value of parks for public health was also highlighted through our public survey. So 85% of Canadians said parks had a positive impact on their mental health, 81% on their physical health, and 71% on their social well-being. But it's important to mention that we also learned that the health benefits of parks are not evenly distributed. So when we take a closer look at that mental health stat, we learned that while 88% of Canadians who identified as white said that parks had a positive impact on their mental health, this number was actually 16% lower for respondents who identified as Indigenous and 19% lower for respondents who identified as Black. So these are, significant and sort of troubling gaps that highlight that not everyone is benefiting from parks in the same way. And in the report, we really dig into this issue by exploring the idea of social access to parks and how that mediates health benefits. So thinking not just about walking distance to the nearest park, but focusing more on what's in the park when you get there and how it makes you feel. So for example, is it safe, comfortable? Does it have culturally appropriate amenities? Do you see yourself reflected there? These are all sort of experiential dimensions of park access that are not talked about as often as the size and quantity of parks, but they have sort of deep implications for people's ability to benefit from parks. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I would recommend not only checking out the growth section of the report, but also reading Nada Hassan's work. I had the privilege of interviewing her for the report, and I'll drop a link to some of her work in the chat just in a moment. But we also learned that some cities are starting to think more deeply and address this. So for example, Brampton's Uptown Framework includes a focus on nighttime activation of parks and public spaces in recognition that many of their residents are shift workers who might use parks at different times than the 9 to 5 crowd and still need sort of a safe and comfortable experience after hours. Some cities are providing culturally inclusive sport amenities. So for example, Toronto has a cricket strategy in the works, and the city of Surrey is developing new kabaddi facilities. And kabaddi is a contact sport that is popular in some South Asian cultures. And just as a final example, Mississauga has a new park that provides space for scattering ashes in Etobicoke Creek, which is a sort of sacred ritual in Sikh and Hindu cultures that's often prohibited in parks. So creating space for this practice, of course, has profound impacts for health and well-being. And with that, I'll turn it over to the amazing Naomi.
Thanks, Adri. So just to kind of speak more about the central theme that Adri has mentioned about equity, the next couple of findings are going to be really explicit in how we think about diversity and inclusion when it comes to parks and what we hope parks can be as an example for how we exist on all of these lands. But before I talk about the findings, I just want to make it super clear and contextualize that these findings are not new, they're just newly recognized. And when I say that, I mean that communities have generously told and retold us the history of parks the same way they've told and retold us the truth about residential schools or the spread of Islamophobia, and we're just listening better now. So the first finding is that parks are not accessible to everyone, and that to access parks doesn't necessarily mean you will feel safe in them. And this is kind of getting at, again, what Adri was just mentioning. So Canadians who identified as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color were more likely to report experiencing barriers to park use during the pandemic, and 22% reported a fear of harassment. Those numbers are even more stark for Southeast and East Asian Canadians. And by we, I mean non-racialized Canadians are starting to accept this truth more widely. So 77% of all Canadians agreed that aspect of someone's identity, like race, gender, or age, affect how they experience parks. The second finding is that a just future for parks and all lands across Canada require collective stewardship. So Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or BIPOC for short, Canadians were more likely to cite an increased interest in stewardship activities, so 70% compared to 54% of white Canadians. So what the public survey and the city questionnaire showed us is a reflection of the conversations, movement building, and straight up work that communities have been doing. And the stories in this section explore that a bit more through interviews and research into projects across the country. So we spoke with Black, Indigenous, and other leaders of color on how the knowledge and expertise they've built in envisioning a just future for parks has become more valued after a year of land defenders, BLM rallies, and other cries for justice took over public spaces. So this included people like Jacqueline L. Scott, who, if you don't know, is an awesome PhD student at the University of Toronto exploring Black recreation. And she reminds us that people of color are demanding change and they're not going away anytime soon. And a quick shout out to a current project that Jacqueline, in collaboration with our amazing Zahra and Kofi Hope, are putting on now that really speaks to this, and a campaign to really think about and promote racialized people's experiences in outdoor spaces. Another thing that we spoke to people on is what an Indigenous-led stewardship would look and feel like. So Eli Enns of the Ilsak Olam Foundation shared more about the role of parks in displacing Indigenous communities and the importance of reconnecting with the land and every living being that occupies it. A really awesome story here was in the Kitchener-Waterloo area in the land back camp that took place over the course of the second half of 2020 and has been reestablished now in 2021, and the ways that Indigenous-led stewardship can really show us what it means to reconnect with the land around us. And with that, I will pass it on to Jake. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Naomi. So for our last key finding, 2020 and 2021 were obviously the year of the pandemic, but we also saw climate change really as a growing priority in cities. So 84% of cities said that addressing climate change and extreme weather damage was a growing challenge. So this is things like high wind, droughts, fires, flooding, and all of this is unfortunately going to get worse. Canada is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And parks play a key role in mitigation. They help us reduce temperatures. They help us manage rainfall and stormwater and improve air quality. And we see this in the importance with the recent heat waves in BC. It can really be life or death. The positive thing is that more cities are sort of implementing and passing climate change and resilience plans. So 72% of cities this year are showing climate change plans in place. And that's a big jump from last year where it was 44% of cities. And that's due to new cities in the report and also new plans in the last year. And these plans are driving actions like electric equipment. So Victoria shifted 20% of their fleet from gas to electric. Also mapping neighborhoods to uncover areas with less green space, trees and parks. Research shows that these are often lower income areas in cities and they're more prone to heat. They have less access to the climate benefits of parks. And so these mapping exercises will help invest and direct resources more equitably. And you can check out the climate justice story in the nature section for more about this. And we see increased naturalization as well in low-mow meadows, which is a term I really love. And they help reduce energy from mowing, of course, but they also increase biodiversity in cities and increase the cooling impact of these spaces because naturalized and sort of more densely planted areas are actually better at cooling than mowed grass. And so Vancouver is really leading on this with a pilot that they're undertaking right now. And we see cities like Edmonton also, and I think Brampton, who are implementing more naturalization standards into their park development guidelines. Thanks. We also profile a bunch of resilient park projects, recent ones that are either about to be built or have just been built in the last year or so. And Canadians are really supportive of these. 94% of Canadians support more climate resilient infrastructure in parks. So rain gardens, bioswales, increased tree planting. And the image that you see on the screen is from Montreal. It's a plan to green a downtown street, McGill Avenue. This plan will introduce trees and water features and planting and seeding. And as you can imagine, it's increasing the biodiversity of this space by creating more natural space out of something that was mostly pavement on a street, but also helping to reduce urban temperatures, the heat here. And that last point is really important because, as I mentioned, urban heat can be really deadly. In 2018, 66 people died in Montreal in a heat wave. And when they ran the numbers and saw where people had died, they found that people were twice as likely to die in areas that were deemed to be urban heat islands. And these are areas that have more pavement and fewer green spaces. And as I mentioned before, are also often located in lower income communities. So naturalizing streets and thinking about ways that we can kind of build more climate infrastructure into our existing parks can really go a long way to unlocking the potential of green spaces to help mitigate climate change, both heat, as we've seen here, and also flooding. And it also creates these new wonderful green spaces that people can enjoy and that wildlife can enjoy as well. So it's really this kind of like triple win. Great. So just before we get into the discussion, just wanted to let everyone know that we are really excited to launch a new training workshop this year. This is a half-day workshop that features best practices from the report and more key insights. And it's really geared towards park professionals to really help tackle maybe big issues that they're facing and how to uncover some creative solutions. So if you are interested in that, you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at hireus@parkpeople.ca. And you can also visit, hire us at parkpeople.ca. And you can visit parkpeople.ca and you can click on the services tab and go to the Canadian City Parks report and check out more information there. And that's it. I'll turn it back over to our wonderful moderator.
Awesome. Well, if you feel so inclined, just throw your applause in the chat because it'd be nice to to get all that energy. And thanks to the three of you for that awesome report. You took 148 pages and made it a really engaging 20 minutes. So thanks. I've been pulling stuff from the chat. So everyone who's put questions there, we'll try and integrate them into the questions that we had. And if we have time at the end, we'll ask for more. But, I want to ground us in the place where we started around this time last year, and Jake, I remember you specifically, at the launch of our last report, we're talking about how this year, this upcoming year for the third report, you wanted to really embed equity in a different way. And, Naomi, I just really want to also honor what you said, which is newly recognized, right? I think that a lot of what we're talking about is, and we've seen this, right, with what's been happening with the findings of the burial sites across the country, is that, if you look back at the TRC, it's been calling for this for many, many, many years, right? And so I think it's important to honor that this is newly recognized, and that there was a material commitment this year in the report to embed equity in a bit of a different way. So maybe Jake, I'll start with you. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you did it a little bit differently this year, and what you're hoping people will sort of take away?
Yeah, sure. So in years past, we had 5 sections in the report: growth, collaboration, activation, inclusion, and nature. And we had sort of focused discussions of equity in the inclusion section in the past. And this year, we obviously kept that focus in the inclusion section to drive really deep into particular topics, but we took an equity lens into all of the stories that we were writing this year. And that was really important to show how creating more equitable and just cities is really about growth as well as nature. And for me, working in the climate change section, I noticed that equity was really missing from a lot of climate change plans that I was reading from cities. They would often be used as a principle maybe, or in kind of the nice language up front at the beginning of the plan. But when you actually looked at the policies and the actions of those plans, there were not a lot of follow through in terms of equity-based policy or frameworks that they would be using to evaluate their work. And so I wanted to highlight that in the story, and also showcase some cities that were actually kind of moving forward on this. Vancouver, I talk about building an equity framework into their climate emergency plan, and also in the way that they're thinking about prioritizing green space improvements in the future. And then for me also was about highlighting the importance of the social along with the environmental, not just focusing on the environmental benefits, but really tying in the social. And I think you see that in many of the stories as well.
Thanks, Jake. Naomi, Adri, any reflections on this piece?
I can just build a little bit on what Jake said. And I have to say, I'm really glad that Jake went first, because I was like tearing up seeing all the nice messages in the chat. So thanks for saving me from like bawling my eyes out on camera, Jake. But just as another example of how we integrated this equity focus into other sections of the report, the growth section this year is the section that focuses on parks planning. So like how cities are coping with the pressures of population growth on their parks. And that's where we integrated the series on planning parks for public health. So there's lots of literature on planning parks for public health, and it often recommends things like making sure that parks are within walking distance, that they have sort of biodiverse natural spaces, because there's like strong evidence that biodiverse areas have mental health benefits. Making sure there are walking loops and other sort of amenities that support physical activity. But again, as I sort of lightly mentioned during the presentation, that sort of misses the whole experiential layer, which is so important to public health. So I just thought I could share an anecdote that was really powerful for me in learning from Dr. Janelle Joseph, who is one of the experts. She's a professor at U of T and one of the experts I had the privilege of interviewing. And she has done research with Brazilian martial artists who often practice in parks. And their sport integrates, it's a martial art, but it also integrates elements of dance and music and performance. And she was just telling me how participants in her research, who are often Black men, had reported instances of being stopped by police while they're practicing, the thing that gets them active in parks and sort of is essential to their well-being. So I think that it's just so essential to broaden that public health conversation, to look not just at these built environment factors, but also sort of the formal and informal rules and social expectations that we have in place in parks. So that's just one example of how applying that equity lens really benefited other areas of the report. But Naomi, I know you'll have great insights on this as well.
Haha, as in, no, you said it so eloquently. Sorry, you and Jake both said it so eloquently. And I guess the only thing that I might add is that a lot of these things, when we're talking about park professionals, really integrating equity and making connections between equity and climate change, or equity and public to private collaborations, for example, are completely what communities have been doing anyways. Every time we think about communities who open up a new community garden to address their food insecurity, that is also a climate change mitigation effort. So it's also like that, the simultaneous, the way that I think professional circles are integrating equity, is that communities have also been making connections of how what they're doing and how they're hustling is like really making a difference beyond their hyper local setting.
Yeah, and I think thanks for all that. And I think that all of you touched in different ways on this on the piece, Jake, that you sort of flagged, which is the social infrastructure piece that has to underpin all of this, right? It's like we can build more parks, but if people don't know that they can use them and feel safe to use them, then what are they good for? So I think that piece, goes hand in hand. And so just in the spirit of, some of these, you've sort of like, dropped in a few like winks here around a story I heard or something really interesting. Would love to hear from each of you, just like something really cool, something really interesting. And you can define what interesting means that happened like in city parks through your research, so a story that you heard that was particularly inspiring. I did note that someone had a question about cross-departmental collaborations at the municipal level. So if any of these stories that you tell involved more than the Parks Department at the municipality, flag that, because I know that there's some interest, but would love just to hear some of the great stories that you found through this research. And maybe Naomi, if it's okay, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's totally fine. We can let Jake off the hot seat. So one of the stories that I think is really indicative of the types of collaboration between communities and parks departments was really inspiring for me was I spoke with Carmen Rosen from the Still Moon Art Society in Vancouver. And for those who don't know about the Still Moon Art Society, it's a really great community-based group that seeks to animate the spaces in their neighborhood. And one of the programs that Carmen so kindly shared with me is one that has been kind of a long time coming, and that Carmen has really made an effort as a white settler to make relationships with a lot of the Indigenous communities in and around the areas that she was animating. And eventually, when one of the Parks Department's programs through their field houses came up, she thought to collaborate with one of those people that she had made relationships with, Jolene Andrews, to start up the program Resurfacing History. And the Resurfacing History program is Indigenous led. It's like facilitated in collaboration with Still Moon Art Society, and it's through this field house program in Vancouver. And it helps to reconnect elders and knowledge keepers with youth and other urban Indigenous people who want to learn about what lands they are and how their connections to those lands have been erased by colonialism. And so I thought that was a really great story about the kind of ways that we can all be really tangibly participants in these types of reconciliation efforts, and that it doesn't mean that we have to just sit back, but we can be really active. Yeah.
And that it's imperative, right? It's like it's shared responsibility. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Adri.
Okay, well, I was like flip-flopping on what to share because there's so many inspiring things that come out of this report every year. But if I can, I actually would like to speak about something in Naomi's stories that really inspired me. Naomi mentioned a little bit during the presentation, but one of the things that she wrote about was sort of the City of Kitchener's work in hiring an Indigenous Parks Engagement Associate, sort of not as a response to, but out of sort of building recognition that was sort of an underserved population in the city's park system, and with the presence of Land Back Camp in one of their signature parks last year. So I guess what struck me as sort of inspiring about that is just we've seen so many movements, as Naomi writes about so well in her stories, in the past year, protests and occupations and demonstrations in parks. And I just thought this was a nice example of a city sort of responding openly to that and being willing to change and actually examine their own practices and what they could be doing better, rather than sort of just looking at how to, you know, remove the problem from the park kind of thing. And I should also say that the city of Waterloo, I believe, implemented a fee waiver for Indigenous groups in parks so that they, you know, for cultural events wouldn't have to sort of go through the park permitting process, which I think is such an essential step. So I guess that's just an inspiring example on sort of more of the municipal led side of things.
You know, Adri, you're making me think of our park summit a number of years ago when Rina Sutar was our keynote, or one of the keynotes, and talked about the actual design of parks and things like vistas, and how vistas were sort of residue from colonial design, and even just hearing about rethinking the actual park space and having it accommodate, you know, uses of a plurality of people. It's like, it's such a massive start, right? She talked about these specific moments in parks that we don't recognize actually hold a lot of colonial history. Jake, you're up.
I go back to a quote that I really love that I heard from a fellow named Travis Canadian, who I interviewed in the story about nature partnerships and collaboration. And Travis is a community member that works with the Bell Island Caretakers Circle, which is a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks that are sort of caretaking and stewarding Bell Island, that sacred site in Kingston. And when I asked him what advice he would have for other groups that are, you know, community-based, that are looking to, you know, get into work around parks, his advice was to embrace your inner tortoise. And I really like that, and I've thought about it a lot over the last several weeks. You know, just the idea that like doing good work takes time, and you have to recognize, you know, the importance sometimes of process, and slow down, and you know, like really work at taking the time to build relationships. So I think about that quote probably several times a week now. It's really stuck with me.
Yeah, the Adrian Murray Brown, right? Moving at the speed of trust. Not something that, especially municipalities, right? Like, you know, are not great at that. And, you know, that's some old systems, right? But it's moving really slowly and intentionally to build a good thing once versus, you know, something many times. I'm feeling a little torn because there's a lot of great questions in the chat. I know that there's so much we're trying to cover. And I just want to flag for some folks before I ask the next question. There were some questions earlier in the chat around how this amazing group of humans got this data. If you go to, there's a section in the report, Jake, and I'm trying to remember what it's called, but there is a section that outlines how, you know, how you access data from different municipalities because they manage it so differently. That's right?
Yeah, you can go to the website and check out the methodology section, and it kind of lays out the work that we did to collect this data. But we, as I mentioned in the presentation, sent out a questionnaire that every city filled out, and then we worked with them to verify that data. So all the cities had a chance to verify their data, but you can check it out more on the website.
Awesome, thanks, Jake. So just gonna change direction just for a moment here in the few minutes that we have, because I think, you know, we have used our parks this year, right? We have all used them in different ways, perhaps than we had used before. And so what do you think, right? Like what is the ask of municipalities? Because you also talked about, you know, Adri, you talked about the sort of the hit that parks departments took during this pandemic. And some folks had questions around, you know, how do we galvanize our municipalities to continue to infuse the energy where the energy is, which is very much in parks. So, you know, a couple questions like, you know, what's the call? What do we need to ask and invite our municipalities to do? But also, what's the future of this investment in parks? Like, what are you excited about? What do you think is going to stick from over the past year?
I can maybe just start off with a really cool example that sort of highlights, I guess, how this momentum that we've seen in some cities with pilot projects during COVID is potentially carrying into the future. So the city of Vancouver implemented a slow streets program, which involved pedestrianizing streets. Many cities did sort of similar versions of this type of program. But what's really cool about Vancouver is that they actually sort of, not as a direct result, but sort of as part of the momentum and conversation around slow streets, council directed staff to explore permanently transitioning 11% of the city's street space to people-friendly public spaces, which is, I think it's just incredible to have such sort of a firm sort of target for transitioning that space in the future that all emerged during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's great. Naomi, Jake?
Naomi, you want me to go? I'll go. Yeah, I think, one of the interesting things for me or looking over the last year is we've certainly seen a change in how people are using parks. Like that's pretty clear, like more people in parks doing, many different things than they might have previously, including myself. I'm not a winter person and I was definitely out in parks much more in the winter last year. But I'm really excited and optimistic about seeing a change in how we value parks, not just use them. I've seen like much more conversation, sort of mainstream conversation about parks as kind of these essential services and thinking about them as social and health infrastructure in our cities, as well as like, lovely, nice to have places, so that to me, like really, I'm heartened by that, and even seeing that at like the political level. So I think back to, I don't know when it was, this is a very Ontario specific example, but the Ontario Minister of Municipal Affairs actually walked back changes that were coming to Ontario that would have limited the ability of some Ontario cities to get parkland from development. And actually in recognition of, in the sort of release about walking back those restrictions and those changes to those bylaws, recognize the importance of parks because of the pandemic. And so to me, that was just like, like people are seeing really the value here, even at high political spaces where they might not have before. And so I'm optimistic about that conversation.
Yeah, and I think I'm to kind of like follow up is I'm optimistic about the conversations, and Adri talks about this quite a bit in her section, I think, as well as Jake, about expanding what we think are appropriate uses for park spaces. And I think that comes not only from like people expanding their ideas of what is appropriate, but also from residents just being comfortable taking up space in parks, and not in ways that are exclusionary, and not in ways that define boundaries for other people to use their space, but in ways that are in relationship with and in connection with other people. So I like that kind of, I think like conversation that's happening as residents take up more space and people realize that that's what a park is for too.
Yeah, Naomi, that's such a beautiful, like it's a beautiful vision, right? For us to move out of our orthodoxy that park design is static, right? Like, the activities of parks are ephemeral, they're constantly changing. Parks are dynamic places. But when it comes to the actual design of parks, it's a little set it and forget it, right? And I love this idea of being in dialogue and constantly sort of adapting to serve, which is what we saw a lot. We saw this with, Adri, to your example with streets, right? And expanding the notion of what's possible for parks is going to be the exciting part of what's ahead. I think there's a friend and collaborator of mine, Adam Roy Cahoon, who works in the space of disability justice. And he always says that during COVID, all the stuff that people said was impossible is now possible. So the accountability is now keep it possible. Like museums have to offer virtual tours all the time now because they can, right? And they showed that they could. So, I have 10 more questions, but I'm going to try and keep it to 2. But Jake, you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, like, I see that like in the amount of cities that said that they were putting more emphasis on building community gardens in the parks during and after the pandemic, to address issues around food security, or cities that were saying we're putting washroom access and all season washroom access at the top of the priority list next year, or one city, I think it was Kelowna, was talking about how they were rethinking their seating in parks to think about more group seating opportunities because of how much social activity was happening in parks. So I mean, you think about like going to the park and sitting on a bench, and it's like you can sit with two people facing one direction. And so like just the idea of like thinking how we can, I don't know, accommodate some of these new uses in some of the design and maybe a little bit more of a flexible way, and build in some of those pieces around food security, you know, is really exciting.
Yeah, and dignifying how we come together, right? Jake and Adri, you'll remember my strong advocacy for side tables beside benches in parks that people could put their food down, you know, and we can come together in a way that's dignified. I haven't lost that, but that's for another time. So a couple quick questions before we wrap. There's so much more to cover, but I have noticed in the bios of all the folks, you know, who have introduced themselves in the chat that we have such a diverse group and a lot of residents, right? A lot of folks who are not necessarily working in the municipality, but working with grassroots organizations or nonprofits or PhD. I've seen a few PhD students pop up. So I'm just wondering, like, if you're a resident and you're reading this report and you want to get more involved or take action, what's some of the counsel you would give to help people get active in all these things we've spoken about today?
I can start us off. I think there's like quite a few ways, and a lot of the stories that are in the report kind of like provide really nice examples, and that's what I'm really excited for when residents read the report, is the examples of what they can implement. But I would say and one of those examples is Hope Blooms in Halifax, who have like this really amazing like social enterprise that engages youth and the land and food security to give back. To the community. So I would say thinking about really ways that people can meet every type of need in a park, whether that's like the way that they engage with nature and how that is like really healing, but also to meet your material needs of like, well, I need to like go to school, and Hope Blooms like creates a scholarship for their students, for the youth to be able to go to school. So thinking about like how can parks meet all of these different needs that you have as a person living in cities, and then also how you can engage with what your community is doing. Les Jardins Le Coup, like in just outside of Montreal, is a black-led farm that sells the produce from their farm to Montreal residents, and how even that way that you are buying from these from your community members and helping sustain them in the ways that they are engaging parks, I would say is another great way. Just stay in your community. I guess it's like in general, always stay in your community.
You're all being so
I think like one of our main goals of the Canadian City Parks Board has always been to support advocacy, you know, in different communities, and provide, you know, residents and community members with like the knowledge and the statistics, and as Naomi mentioned, like the inspiring examples to advocate in their own communities for things that they think are missing, or that they would really benefit from. So I would say, you know, you can read you know, the stories, as Naomi mentioned, and there's a lot of really inspiring examples there. There's people in those stories that we've talked to. You know, I'm like, as I mentioned, we talked to over 40 experts. They're all in the report, and they're amazing, and their names are there, and you can Google them, and then you can contact them and or talk to them yourselves maybe. But I would also check out the city profiles, which are in the back of the report. This is where we've compiled and kind of crunched some of the numbers and that the cities have given us. And so you can see, like, is your city one of the few without a climate change action plan? Is your city one of the 50% that doesn't have a park group program? You know, do you want to see more equity-based planning tools? And is your city one of the ones that, you know, doesn't have one of those? You know, then I think you can sort of go back to your city council or your community and organize around that with the knowledge that you have. So I hope that that's helpful to people, and I'd always love to hear, you know, how people use the report. So please, if you end up, you know, if you end up being inspired by one of these examples and advocating for it, or bringing something like this, whether you're a city staff person or a resident, please contact us, because we love to hear those stories.
I just want to add one quick thing since Jake mentioned the city profiles, which is that we also actually list if the city has a formal volunteer program, like an Adopt a Park program or something like that, or a grant program to provide funding to community groups to do events in parks. We actually have listed links to those programs on that city profile. So it's like a really direct way to get involved if you're super excited after this webinar and want to jump right on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. And thanks for all of that. And I think, you know, the takeaway I'm walking away with is that, like, we have the permission, right? Like, you're not ordained to organize in your park. Like, you organize like with a person, like, I think there is, you know, especially when you have a plurality in your status, whether it's that you're not, whether, you know, beyond the homeowner, right? Like, if you're a renter, you work in a neighborhood, you're a caregiver for someone in a community, there's all these sort of, it's vague. Our permission feels sort of a little vague, whether or not we're allowed or to organize. And so I think what I'm hearing from all of you is just, you know, get to work, right? Find the thing and get to work. So that's amazing. So I am just going to ask one really quick question. I don't know if all of you have an answer, but it's nice to get excited for next year. I know you just finished this and you're trying to take a beat, but just in the spirit of, while it's all fresh in your mind, what's the thing you're excited about digging into in the next Parks report that maybe came up this year, or you want to get to know a little bit more? Can you give us a teaser for next year? What's something that you're really excited about for the next iteration of the Canadian City Parks report?
Ooh, that's so hard. There's so many. Adrian and I were just talking about this yesterday. You know, last month was Pride Month, and you know, something that we explored a little bit in the first iteration of the report is queer spaces and parks and public spaces, and that's something that I would love to look at a little bit more. You don't see a lot of writing about that in Canada, so that's a topic that I would that I'm excited to dig into more next year.
Awesome.
To be fully transparent, that conversation Jake and I had yesterday, I was like, my brain is tapped out. I've just written all I can write on parks. So I don't know if I have like a lot of inspiration at the moment, but I will just say, like, I didn't have a chance to really mention it too much on this call, but last year we included quite a deep dive on homelessness, which I think has been, you know, such a major issue in parks in the past year. So maybe there's an opportunity to revisit that research and do some sort of an update based on all of the learnings from these past 2 years. And I'll drop a link in the chat to that section from last year as well if people want to check it out.
Naomi, anything else before we close?
Yeah, I'm just gonna put Adrian kind of on the spot because something that she said yesterday that I was also really excited about, but that she's like forgot to mention, was like the innovative use of tools, Adrian, you were talking about, that I was also like really snapping my fingers yesterday about how we can combine all of these types of, whether it's like through climate change and equity and like different priority populations that we might identify. How can we put those things in metrics and help park professionals put that into practice? I was really, really into that. And that's all Adri, but I'm just going to echo her sentiment.
Well, I think the conclusion is that we all wish we were there for that conversation with you three yesterday, but are so grateful that we got this conversation today. While I'm just saying a few thank yous, if you could just drop a word in the chat that describes your vibe, your energy, your feeling in this moment, just one word is fine, but just to close with some energy, I want to say thank you to our authors for this work and this energy. It is so cool that this is happening. It is so important that you continue to improve it and respond to the changing context of our dialogue in the moment. So thank you so much for doing this work and showing up and bringing such beautiful energy today. Thanks to all of you who care so much about parks and keep your communities inspired, connected, and safe, have been over this last year, and we hope continue to do. And please read the City Parks Report and get in touch with our awesome authors around how inspired you're getting, things you're doing, and any great feedback you have so we can continue to improve this awesome, awesome asset. And with that, we'll say thanks for joining. Thanks for all the love in the chat, and we will see you soon.